Okay. So, who is Accountability for Dearborn? I'm hoping most of you know who we are by now in some respect, but we're a group of Dearborn residents who are working to build a culture and expectation of accountability and action in the city to make the city safe for Black residents, students, employees, and visitors. So you most likely may have heard about us either through the paper, but we're also on every city council meeting, usually advocating for defunding of the police department, but we also raise other social issues there. So if you ever want to hear about us there or set up a meeting, you can contact us or kind of listen to us through that avenue. Our mission is to hold the city of Dearborn accountable for eliminating institutional racism by identifying policies, ordinances, and procedures that result in racial disparities and replacing those mechanisms with anti-racist ones. So hopefully a little bit, over whatever your social justice education has been, you might have heard the term anti-racism. And because it's a focus of the presentation, I'll be giving kind of a mini working definition of it so that we can, be a little bit on the same page and you won't have to ask if you're not quite sure. So just before we start out here, I want to do some non-negotiables. The first one is racism exists. The second one is lived experiences are valid. So what that kind of means is when people are talking about what they've experienced, we want to listen to that and we want to give respect to that no matter whether we agree or whether we understand what someone's talking about. Impact over intent. So when we're talking, we want to think about how our words are impacting people as opposed to whether we meant them to be good or not, because the impact is really what's mattering. You can be both the oppressed and the oppressor, and I think that's an important one to keep in mind. And social barriers are human-made. And what's great is that in this charter discussion, hopefully we can think about how to take away those man-made human barriers or social barriers. And intention setting. So I've talked a little bit already about this, but we're going to be discussing the big picture elements of the city charter. So we'll talk about it in respect to like what it is generally, but then ours too. And we'll identify areas of improvement for our city charter and work together to imagine a charter that supports a safe, a caring, and an anti-racist community. And through all of that, and maybe in another charter session or however we want to do this at the end, we can start talking about concrete ideas to build a foundation for a better Dearborn. So defining anti-racism. So I want to start out by saying that I probably am not the right person to be defining anti-racism as how I see it, but I do want to share some really important quotes from writers and authors, activists that have kind of put their definition on it or explained it in a certain way that I think many people can really reckon with or resonate with. So in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. And so when we're thinking about what it means to be anti-racism, it's important to keep in mind that we're not trying to erase histories or pretend that race isn't there or pretend that racism doesn't exist in certain ways. But what we're trying to do is become against racism, right? Become anti-racist. And so Ibram X. Kendi too, who's the second quote that I have listed up here, one allows racial inequities to preserve as a racist or confronts racial inequality as an anti-racist. There's no in between safe space for not racist. The claim of not racist is, or neutrality is a mark for racism. So again, as we're talking about these issues, we have to reckon with the fact that there's going to be a lot of painful histories and there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to need to overcome together in order to be able to, move forward and create this city that really is working for everybody. And just a little bit of housekeeping. Like I said, the presentation will be recorded. And if you want to jump in the middle, I'm totally happy with that. Please use the chat or the raise hand feature. I can already see that I can see the chat really easily. So if you want to use chat, that might be best. And I'll just read out your question or comment. The raise hand's also cool. And a reminder to critique ideas and not people, because we want to make a good space for everybody. And at the end of this, I'll email this presentation to everybody in case they want to look at it again and have like a short charter to look at, because the real one's probably about 38 pages and it's kind of long and you don't have to really, there's a lot of things that maybe don't need to be addressed at this point. So why the charter? So a city charter operates to be the city constitution. And so in a lot of ways, this constitution, it kind of models the US Constitution, and it outlines our city policies and procedures for mayor, for city council, and general governance. So August 3rd is the primary election. And like I was saying a little bit earlier, this is when we're going to have the opportunity to decide whether we want to open up the charter for revision. So normally, when we want to edit the charter, we're going to have to collect signatures in order to pass an amendment, or as we had this year, we waited until the date outlined in the charter for when there's an automatic proposal to be put onto the ballot in order to open it up. So this is an opportunity that comes only once, I think about 15 years, where it just automatically can be opened up just during voting. And I think it's probably likely it'll be opened up, but this is something we're probably gonna have to work with to get people to understand how important it is, to know that if we open it up, it's a good thing for our community. And so if it does get opened up at the general election, we'll be able to vote for 9 people who sit on a commission to revise the charter. As far as I understand, you really don't need to know about the charter to necessarily sit on the commission. You just need to have a desire to want to change it. So this is like a 2-year-long process, and I believe the applications are still open, and you would have to get them from the city clerk. There's just a public notice about it, and it'll be on the city website if anybody wants to look at it. And I also think there's a couple people who may be running for charter commission here, and I hope this helps, and you can definitely ask questions and we can try to figure it out together. So already explained a little bit of why now, but an interesting fact is that this hasn't been updated since 2008. So honestly, if you look at other city charters, sometimes they haven't been opened up for like a long time. Like in Warren, they have some prohibition on people riding horses to the polls. So our city charter is not that old, but you know, a lot has happened since 2008. So we can, oh yeah, Jerry said signatures are due back by 7:20, and Laura Dungeon is running. So yeah, so it's not the oldest charter, but it's, as we'll see, there's definitely some ways we can make this something that really reflects the people. And I just included this little provision of the charter that at the city primary election to be held in 2021 and in each 12th year thereafter, that's when we're going to be able to have that vote open up. And it takes about 2 years. So what is a city charter? And to be honest, I didn't know what it was until the people from Accountability for Dearborn started talking about it, and like 3 months later, I still didn't know what it was, but it's basically a constitution. And the city charter is a basic document, and it's going to outline the powers, the procedures of the Dearborn city government. And that's sort of modeled to the same effect as the US Constitution. So the reason I'm going to talk a little bit about the US Constitution is because what's slightly different about ours is that in the US Constitution, there is a Bill of Rights. And this is what we know as like the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to a civil jury, right to jury trial, you know, all these, it's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And if you want to take a look at this, I took this from my con law class, my constitutional law class. And so these are just to get you a little bit familiar with what I'm talking about as individual liberties, because we kind of know that we have these things. We know we have the right to free speech. We know we have the right to a speedy public trial and whatnot, but these are also kind of important. And I want you to keep them in mind, as these individual liberties, meaning the things that you and I have the power to have the freedom to do, and how we can incorporate individual liberties into a city constitution, because ours is not quite like this. And I think that there are some really special things we can do for Dearborn to have like a Dearborn Bill of Rights, but we'll get there. Okay, so I'll sit on this slide for just a second, but like if you want to, you can keep these questions in mind. And I think this will make it so it's not like just me talking. You can actually kind of actively listen for things when I'm explaining a little bit of it. But I want you to think about, how can we create an anti-racist charter? How can we incorporate the ideas of working against systemic racism, not just passively, but like actively working against it, and include that into our city constitution? Generally, how can we increase accessibility? So in what ways are you seeing your city government not accessible to people? And that can be very across the board. This is the idea of these social barriers that we know are human made, and like, what can we do to make it so that our city charter addresses those issues? How can we minimize our reliance on police? So that's one of the big tenets of accountability for Dearborn, is because, as we know, this by now, many people I think might know, the police, they take up a large part of not only the budget of Dearborn, but they have a major role in a lot of the everyday things that we see. I mean, they are, we see people patrolling the streets. We have a particular relationship with the police in Dearborn. And how can we take that, minimize it, and reinvest into our community? How can we do those things through the charter? How can we create equity and make things better for all members of our community, whether we know them or not? And finally, how can the charter be democratized? And what I mean by this is, how can we make this like for the people and not necessarily have powers concentrated into the mayor and into the city council or just any other city government areas? How can we do it so that it's all for us? And well, not all for us, but so that we have a balance, right? How do we make it for the people? Okay, the Dearborn City Charter. Okay, so I'll let you just take a look at this screen, and if it's a lot and like you don't really need to remember this, because we'll go through a little bit of each provision, but the main things that we want to talk about, especially given the election coming up where we're going to be electing a new mayor, where at least we'll have at least 3 new council members, but we'll be voting for city council as well. We're having the opportunity for a very huge change in our political power. And I think that that's going to create a lot of election activity. So we should really be well versed in what the people that we elect are going to be able to do when we elect them. These are just a couple more charter sections. So we'll cover a little bit about the executive department, and that really means like the mayor. Okay. So if you're still looking at the screen and you want to take a minute to read about this Declaration of Rights, I'll talk about it kind of briefly, but the Declaration of Rights mirrors what those Bill of Rights were that I was talking about before. So the way that the US government works, we have, this right to free speech and all that stuff. We have it no matter what. So of course, we don't need to really repeat this into our charter, but I want you to think about, what are the things that we see in our community that we need to declare as a freedom for all of us? In the Declaration of Rights we have currently, it talks a little bit more about what the city government's going to do. It talks a little bit less about our specific rights. So it does mention the right to expect the dedicated and efficient performance of duties by all officers and employees, but I kind of want us to be a little more selfish. I want us to look at this and think, okay, we have a right to have our public officials work for us, but what other big things do we want? Because if we can include them here, that means we can fight for them. And that means you have a legal basis to say, hey, I have a right to this, and I should be treated by being given this right or somehow remedied and somehow, we have this fixed. So the people have the right to expect that the quality of services rendered by the city will be protected. These are all good things to have here. We want to make sure our city is working for us. But as we talk a little bit more about this, I think there are things we can add to the Declaration of Rights. And yeah, in the Open Meetings Act section, the business of the legislative body. And the legislative body, if you are unaware, that's the city council. So the city council kind of has the right to make, they have similar activities as like what the Congress would do. So Congress makes laws. And so that's why the city council is kind of like the legislative body. They're the ones who are kind of approving ordinances, approving budgets, denying them, modifying, or at least working with the mayor to figure out something different. Okay, so the compensation of officers. So when we talk about officers in the city charter, they're talking about government officials or government, people who work in the city government. So the city council, those are officers of, so you don't have to think about it like a police officer or something, it's a governmental officer. Right now, the council is paid, and it's not quite stated here, they're not full-time employees. And that's kind of what I wanted to show this slide for. So the persons who are appointed, they shall receive only one salary, which shall together with such other remuneration as specified in the resolution of council be in full compensation for their appointees' services into the city, and shall not receive any other compensation from the city. So while this isn't exactly talking about their wages, I think this is a very important area where if you wanted to have city council members who were working full-time and were really able to dedicate those times to the people, this is a provision that could absolutely be modified to get that demand in there. And also, if people are having issues with where council members, how costs are shared in our city, this is also kind of a way, and it says it in here, to like get away from these conflicts of interest, and that can be in things like endorsements or something. This is all somewhere where you could kind of insert stuff like that. So proceedings for the removal of city officers. I didn't quote this word for word from the charter, but right now these are the options that we have. So what we can do is we can, the council can vote to remove an officer based on reasons listed in the charter. So the major reasons are like for felony, for violations of the law, of charter rules, corruption. They're all very specific. And there's also the other option is residents can submit a petition signed by 200 other residents and 2 council members. And then council will hold a hearing and make that determination whether the council member is approved. So if you think about this rule and think about whether that satisfies as a citizen your desire for when something goes wrong in your city, or when there's an issue you have with a city officer, it's something that, can be really important, because we want to obviously elect people we want there, but we have to be able to take control when there are things that are going bad. So this is truthfully not that different than a lot of other city charters, but if you think about the different ways we can, impeach a public official in other ways, sometimes those can be included in a charter. and I guess I should have said this at the beginning, but anything that's included in a city charter can't violate the law. I don't know yet what the stipulations on that are, but we can't violate the law. So just, probably obvious, but I just want to point that out. And the reason I included this question at the bottom, can we get language on electronic petitions? During this past year, obviously everything was online. And if there was something really emergency going wrong in your city, would you have felt comfortable necessarily to go around and do a petition? So if we don't have any language on it, which means if there's no language on it, we can't fight for it as well as we want to. So if you think about the fact that when things are left out of a charter, that makes it harder for you to advocate for it, that's one of those things we can think about. And that's one thing that would be probably great here if possible. Okay, so rules of order. So in this section, there's parts of the charter that dictate how the council and how our mayor are able to conduct business. One thing I want to point out in here is that I highlighted a couple of things, or I made them bold, and this is not how it was in the charter. That's some additions I made, like where it says English language and newspaper of general circulation. I'm highlighting them just so you take a look at them. I just want to make that clear. But so the rules of order, and that applies to the city council. So the city council determines its own rules in order of business, except as otherwise provided in the charter, and shall keep a journal of all the proceedings in such meetings in the English language and in accordance with this charter. The reason I'm highlighting the English language is because, as you're aware, in Dearborn, there's a very large Arab and Muslim population, and that many people in the Arab communities speak Arabic. And right now, there's no requirement in many of our, well, there's no requirement in the charter, first of all, but unless it's, a certain community organization, there's not necessarily a requirement from our government that things be provided in other languages. So if we want real transparency in our government, that's a great place to start, having their rules available to the public. And the official newspaper. So the council shall designate a newspaper of general circulation in the city. And as far as I know, and truth be told, I'm not entirely sure if there are copies of the newspaper in another language. I don't think there are, but this is a way that you can advocate for your community in order to make sure that we're actually including everybody who should be included. Okay, moving on to administrative officers. So the administrative officers are the mayor, and that's why I highlighted the mayor. Again, these emphases are added. But the mayor with the council may combine any administrative offices, departments, or separate or eliminate them in any matter it considers advisable for the proper and efficient operations of the city. So this is probably not something that seems like all that big of a deal, but if you consider the fact that there's no opportunity for people, right? If we see that there should be an administrative office that we want to, to change, to be separated, to be eliminated, we don't at this point have a way of doing that. And that can be a problem, especially considering resources in our city. We know that, well, from looking at the budget meetings, we know that we need to really be mindful of the resources our city has to make sure that we're doing things efficiently and properly. And actually, that's one of the rights kind of written out in the very beginning that we have. So if we want to demand for it, it's not quite explicit. We don't have that opportunity. But again, in the administrative officers, there's lots of space on this page for additions. Okay, so this is a lot. This looks like a lot of information, but I'll just, instead of reading it off the page, I'll just tell you kind of what it says. But the city council has the power to create departments that are effective and create efficient services for us. So when you go to a city council meeting and you want to talk about, well, what can the council do for us? Here's a lot of different areas that they can work in: public safety, health and welfare, maintenance and expansion of public infrastructure, finances, legal representation, taxes. They got a lot of power. They can do a lot. And so that's why when we are talking in these city council meetings, we talk so much about public safety. We want our council members to want to work with us on this, right? And health and welfare, especially in the times after the pandemic. You know, what are we looking for there? And this other section 10.9 of the charter, the multi-member bodies. I wouldn't be surprised if most of us don't know how many multi-member bodies and also how many different like commissions are in the city, but except as provided in this charter, the council may by ordinance create or discontinue these multi-member bodies. So again, this is kind of a provision where it's all up to the council. So do we want to think about ways that we have some checks and balances on that power, right? You don't want to keep everything concentrated to one specific area. And if you have come on to the city council meetings recently, but you may have heard about these minimum staffing provisions. So our city is going into a new budget era, right? And the budget season right now during all of this discussion it doesn't look great right now for the city. We're planning to have to potentially pass some millages. We don't have a budget where we're going in, we have a budget where we're going in and we're going to come out with less money at the end of the year, right? In almost any circumstance, even with a millage. So we have a budget that right now is losing for us. One of the big things that prevents our city from being able to fund into different departments is we have to maintain a staffing level for the police department and for the fire department. Sorry, just checking in the waiting room. So right now we have in the police department that the city shall employ no less than 2.1 full-time paid sworn officers for each 1,000 people residing in the city. So a little history on this is these minimum staffing provisions, I believe I want to say it was in 2011, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I should honestly be able to remember this, but Governor Snyder passed a law that said that these minimum staffing provisions inside of a charter can't go on anymore. You know, they have to be eliminated or they're not lawful. There's a part of this law that says like if it's in the charter and the charter doesn't get changed, basically it kind of just stays there until the charter gets changed again. So that's why it's sitting here. It's not technically, I mean, it's technically illegal, but it's at the same time, it's not, if that makes any sense. It's, you know, we can't add these to charters, but because it's here and we haven't changed the charter, there's nothing we can really do about it. So it kind of has to sit here and it kind of controls our lives. And recently the city council accepted a police union contract that also has staffing requirements. So we are very bottlenecked in the way that like we can't really get rid of these staffing provisions unless, you know, we could have passed an amendment, you know, by doing a petition like I had said earlier, but again, COVID. So these are just things to think about. And with the fire department, it's going to automatically drop off if we open up the charter though. And I just want to kind of point this out there. We don't want to be keeping any kind of a minimum staffing probably for any department, you know, but just want to bring that up. If we open it, these will go away and we don't have to do a charter petition drive, and you know, it saves a lot of steps and it's a great thing to do. Okay, so thank you for sitting with me through that honestly kind of boring part of the presentation, but I have a really, and I hope you find it too, really exciting ideas to make this like charter that's kind of just a lot of legal words, really, that, unless somebody kind of tells you what's in it, I don't know if you're really going to read it and retain it. Here's some really cool things that we can do with the charter that's going to make it like, oh my God, a charter. This is actually exciting. So, okay, anyway, I'm just really excited about this part. And like I had said before, where can we put these multilingual requirements for city documents in the newspaper? These were the sections I talked about before, the rules of order for city council, the official newspaper. You could have your city clerk do it. What else? Where else could we put these things, And I put this little picture of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Of course, it's a much bigger department, but they have options in Arabic and Spanish. Especially, I know that if you're in Dearborn and you're receiving any kind of correspondence from them, there's an option to get everything in Arabic. And we have a lot of people who are qualified to do translations. One point of issue that we would probably have is budget. But again, we can keep in mind, how are we going to divest from certain parts of our budget in order to make this a priority for us? We can do that with the charter. Okay, so, I can't see a year on this. I think this was 2018, something like that, maybe a couple years ago. Detroit, some residents from Detroit wanted to change their city charter. So they included a Bill of Rights. And this is a beautiful Bill of Rights, I think. And it's something very important for Detroit that we could obviously maybe draw some inspiration from, especially when it comes to things like the right to environmental health. Because I think, as many people know, especially towards the south end of Dearborn, the air quality has been a problem for so long. And we don't have, guarantees in the charter necessarily for things like that. We have that the city council should care for public health and whatnot, but what about something very specific? These are really important things for us to demand that are for every single individual who is in Dearborn. Every single person should be able to get clean water, environmental health, right to recreation, safety, housing. And I think I want to focus on the Bill of Rights, because if you look at these things, right to live free from discrimination, access and mobility, these are things that are impacting the most vulnerable people in our society often, right? There are sometimes, if you're in Dearborn, you really don't maybe even have to think about some of these things. But there are people who do have to really fight for this stuff. And there's no better way, I think, with the charter to recognize that we have problems and that we care about who it affects than by straight up saying it in your charter. So what if that was right there in the beginning? How cool would that be? Maybe we could have even a graphic. I would love that. The charter is black and white. Let's make it pretty. All right. So in doing my internet research when I should have been doing homework, escapades, I looked up some other ways that cities were divesting from certain parts of their budget to invest in others. So I was specifically looking, how do people divest from their police departments to give to other parts of the budget. So in 2018, the city of Baltimore added an amendment to their charter, and it's called an equity fund. And what they did was they took 3% of what the police budget was, and for them that was 15 million. Right now, our police department budget it's about 48 million in total, I believe. And that includes like an addition onto the general fund. So, but that's the total budget of it, right? Give or take a few million. If we took 3% of the budget, and I'm not going to do that off the top of my head. If somebody, if you really want to put the calculation in there and not make me look foolish, you can put it in the chat, but take 3% of what our budget is and think about how we could apportion that or give it to another part of the city, right? What if in Baltimore they established, well, I guess they didn't put it on here. It was like a social equity fund. Thank you, Beth. I love you. 3% of 48 million is $1,440,000. So I don't know. That's a lot of money. And probably Beth will also be able to correct me if I'm wrong. I believe when we did have a health department, it cost about that much or less than that much. We were paying per year for a health department. So, you know, I would have to argue a beautiful way to use the equity fund would be to put it into a health department. I mean, you know, with COVID, think about how much that could have helped, right? There are cities with health departments that were, you know, we're doing a good job with the vaccine, but what about before that, you know, and what about after that? What other kinds of health issues we're going to be having? That's, you know, public health is paramount. It's fundamental, and we should really value that. So in New York City, they had one. They had one that donated to environmental protection. The one in Baltimore, I think, did to social justice or social equity funds. That's really broad, meaning you could pretty much put it towards anything, right? But you could also be really specific and say the equity fund goes to our health department. So if you think about it like that, oh, okay, less than that for a public health department, 100 to 200,000. I don't know where I thought it said $1 million, but you know what? What if you took $1 million and put it into a health department? I think that would still be pretty good for us. Okay. So this is participatory budgeting practices. Well, what is that, Gina? Well, everybody, participatory budgeting practices, this would be a way of getting us involved in the budget procedure, right? I believe this year when we were having budget sessions, you know, there's public comment, but really the budget comes from the mayor, and the city council will be able to approve and deny certain parts of it. So we don't really see the budget until someone's decided it. Now, what participatory budgeting does, this gives an opportunity to have an independent office that is like administered by the city government or however you want to do it. It's an independent office that provides budget oversight. So that way that we can, if we feel that money is going somewhere where it shouldn't be going, it's not a matter of us just speaking up, but it's a matter of this independent board to look at it and say, hey, you know what, like 3% or, you know, 43% of a budget or more going to a police department seems pretty high, especially for a city Dearborn size. What's going on here? And they could have actual power to do something about it, you know? And while we do like elect our own public officials, and we'll get to this in a little bit, our public officials, I would have to argue, sometimes don't always represent the entire breadth of this community. And part of that has to do with the way that we elect them. So anyway, so this budgeting practice thing, if there's an emergency, they'll allow for temporary reductions of certain parts of the budget. Staffing and administrative costs could be funded by the fund itself. You could have like a little fund for these independent budget councils so that they're able to do something with it. This is just kind of stuff copied from another participatory budgeting thing, and it, you know, I think we could really model something like that. You know, the whole point of having these, you know, even in the US Constitution, but here too, the whole point of having a charter is that we're trying to outline like checks and balances. We're trying to make it so that everybody has a part in making these decisions. And so this is a great way to do it so that, you know, you can't have people who are taking advantage of something. Okay, Police Oversight Commission. There's been talks in the city by some of our groups, including Accountability for Dearborn, but other community groups in the area who, and I won't say anything now unless somebody wants to drop names in the chat because I don't know how public it is yet, but there's some people who are advocating for a Police Oversight Commission. And this is similar to having a group of people being able to look at incidents of misconduct or just general like disparities in policing, and they would have the power to say something about it. So right now in Dearborn, if you have an issue or complaint about the police, the way you formally do it is, depending, I guess, on the complaint, I think you have to talk to, or you have to communicate it to the police chief, and then they do an internal investigation. So there's no requirement that there's kind of no requirement that that we ever know if somebody else looked at it besides the police department. And if you think about that, if you imagine something happened to you and you made a complaint and they were like, we'll take a look, and you just kind of like wait for it to go back. How do you know like what happened there? Right? It's important in any kind of profession, including police, but any kind of profession. You have to be able to have people who are outside of an issue, who can look at something and say, hey, you know what? That can't happen anymore. We can't do stuff like that. And the big part about police oversight is that this gives us transparency. We have the ability to see what's going on and account for that. And this is one from Ann Arbor. So I'll start. I don't have that much time for discussion, but we can always stay a little bit later. But so where are things that we can start? We can talk about how do we make our elections more fair? Right now we have, the way that they elect city council, it's by whoever gets the most votes. And that usually ends up being the, I'm not trying to be mean, but it ends up being the people who have the most money to have these campaigns. And we know that that's coming probably from more the west side. So what about demanding that we have districts, right? You have to have a representative from the east side and the south side. If we have a city council, we want them to be full-time paid so they work for us. We want our city records in other languages. Zoning codes that emphasize affordable housing. How does that affect us? And direct citizen input. And also these little things in gray I included on the end. These are kind of interesting, off-year election policies get a lot less people who come out normally. Right now we have an off-year election policy because, the general election was last year for the country. There's gonna be less people that come out. How does that impact us? Do we want to increase the city council member, the amount of them, like, Biden was talking about, or maybe not Biden, but Democrats were talking about increasing the size of the Supreme Court to get more perspectives on it. These are things we can do. Budget oversight for the city. So, okay. And now I'm going to kind of open it up to discussion, and I'll stop the recording